live. If you have a question, feel free. You'll be able to call in.
Weekday mornings on NRB TV.
Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining us here at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. This week we're going to talk about an issue that sometimes is used as an argument against God. As a matter of fact, I'll bet that the largest percentage of complaints or objections to God's existence usually lies somewhere in this issue of evil. Either evil that's been done to us personally, evil we've seen committed by other Christians, and that might be keeping us from wanting to consider the claims of Christianity. Maybe just historic evil of Christians, historic evil that's been committed anywhere. This is an objection that is sometimes leveled against those of us who believe in God, who believe that God exists. Because how can you have an all-powerful, all-loving God if he doesn't seem to be either powerful enough to stop evil or loving enough to want to stop evil? That is the basis of the objection. Now, I'm going to play for you a sermon I'm going to divide it into two halves, this week and next week. And you're going to kind of go through the steps and the processes of several, I think, reasonable explanations for why God might allow any particular act of evil. But I'm going to cast it out the way I often do when talking about evil as a criminal investigator. Think about that for a minute. What criminal investigators do, detectives, police officers, we typically investigate cases in which an evil event has occurred, and we have to repuzzle the case in order to solve it. And many of the things you learn repuzzling the case to understand why any particular act of evil might have occurred could also be used to look at the issue of evil overall and whether or not it should exclude. Is it a piece of what I would call exculpatory evidence against the existence of God? We'll talk about that in this week's episode. Let me just start, though, by saying that this presentation is part of a larger presentation in which I make the case for God from God's Crime Scene, a book I wrote that'll help you to actually investigate the evidence for God's existence. And I think there are 8 pieces of evidence in the room of the universe that can best be explained by a divine creator outside the room. And this is what we do in the book, God's Crime Scene. And the last piece we look at is evil. So you're going to see today's presentation is simply an excerpt from the larger book, and I hope you will buy that book. As a matter of fact, I just posted online at the website, coldcasechristianity.com, a complete set of teaching materials for those of you who want to teach God's Crime Scene in a smaller setting, either at church or in a classroom. I've posted videos and PowerPoint presentations for the book at coldcasechristianity.com. I hope that helps. Without any further delay, let's go ahead and listen to a sermon on the problem of evil and how we might assess it to see if it actually eliminates God as a reasonable inference.
This is a picture of my dad back in 1974. He's working a case at the time. See, he had the same mustache I had, okay? So anyone's mocking my mustache? Everyone goes through a mustache stage in law enforcement. As a matter of fact, you've got a lot of good cops who work here as part of the security. And most of them, if you still have you noticed that nobody wears facial hair anymore no one has a mustache and no other facial hair? Like we're in a season where everyone's got more than just a mustache. If you're in this room right now and you just have a mustache and no other facial hair, raise your hand. Take a look, everybody. Old guys. Old guys. I rest my case. It's time for you guys. I'm serious. You got to grow the goatee. Got to grow the goatee. If your hair is this color. Okay. So he's walking this guy across to the courtroom. This guy was accused of killing a 10-year-old girl in our city. It was a horrific crime. I won't go into all the details. He's not actually our killer. This is still an open case. But we thought he was for about 18 months. And people would often ask me, when he killed Jackie, or I thought we killed Jackie, why would God allow a 10-year-old girl to be murdered? This is what we do all the time, right? As homicide detectives, you get kind of cold to this. You kind of think, well, I can't worry about the age of my victim or how he or she died. I just got to work the case. But you might get asked this question by family. Why would God allow this to happen to me or happen to Jackie? In answering that question, it's really hard to give you a brief answer because it's complicated. I think there are always more than one factor at work behind any act of evil. Let me show you what I mean. In this particular case, if Jackie wasn't the kind of girl who would get into someone's car, if she wasn't that trusting and that informed, that's why parents, we tell our kids, don't get into a stranger's car. Even if they say, I just talked to your mom and they know my name. If I didn't tell you in advance, do not get in that car. Why do we say that? Because if you don't know that, you're likely to get into a car. If she's not the kind of kid who gets into a car, this doesn't happen. Also, it happened to be a very busy holiday. And on that day, when her parents were making the holiday meal, they weren't paying attention to what Jackie was doing in front of their own house. Was she inside the yard or outside the yard? They didn't know that a car had stopped to talk to her. If it hadn't been a holiday and she hadn't been that trusting, this doesn't happen. So there's now two factors behind this act of evil. But of course, the person who did this, I guarantee you, had a disturbing childhood of his own. That's typically what we discover in these kinds of suspects. And if he isn't the kind of kid who grows up in that disturbing childhood, he doesn't become that kind of predator later. So now we have three factors that are behind this act. Even more interesting, she was in a neighborhood that was very, very unusually secluded. You'd have to know how to get in and out of this part of town to even find that street that she happened to be on. So now you need a fourth thing to be in place in order for this crime to occur. And you'd have to have the kind of car that would make this possible. Without that kind of car, knowing that neighborhood, having that background, finding a girl who is that willing and unwatched, this doesn't happen. 5 things are now in play. There's a sixth. He had to have an opportunity in that moment, in that day, either to be watching and waiting for it, whatever. He had to have an opportunity to do this when nobody had eyes on, because we don't have a single witness of what happened. That's a lot of 6 factors. I could probably go 10 or 12 more factors, right? Let's find the minutiae. And this is why it's so hard for us to solve these cases. As detectives, we have to figure out, well, what are the 6 factors? And then what is the relationship in proportion between the 6 factors? It's a very complex puzzle we're trying to reassemble to figure out why this would happen to anybody. Now, I showed you a minute ago the 8 pieces of evidence that I think point to God's existence, right? Here they are again. Now, 7 of these I think are pretty clear, and they actually, I think I can make a case very briefly for why I think that those 7 point to God as the most reasonable explanation. That's called inculpating evidence, evidence that points toward a particular suspect. But now I want to talk about this outlier here, number 8, evil. Evil doesn't seem to point toward God, it seems to point away from God. And if it does, then it's a piece of exculpating evidence. In other words, I might have 6 or 7 good reasons to think you're the suspect, but if you got an alibi that day and you were in France on the day of the murder, you can't be my suspect. That's the exculpating piece of evidence that would eliminate you as a suspect. I don't care how good the other stuff looks. Is that what evil is? No matter how good the case looks for God, evil's the one thing that points away from God and eliminates him as a suspect? Some people think it is. As a matter of fact, I'll offer for you an ancient argument against God's existence offered by Epicurus. This is 4 centuries before Jesus. Here's what he says. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Well, then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Well, then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Well, then whence cometh evil? Where does that come from? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? Simply put, if there is an all-loving, all-powerful God, why do we have evil? Either he can't stop it, which means he's not all-powerful, so stop calling him that, or he doesn't want to stop it, which means he's not all-loving, stop calling him that. But if there's an all-powerful, all-loving God, he should be able to stop the things we read about this week. The earthquake, the flood, the suicide bomber. None of that should be happening if there's a God. I would have said as an atheist, that is far more consistent with a universe that doesn't give a lick about you. That stuff happens all the time in a universe that doesn't care. But it shouldn't happen in your universe if there's a loving God who's all-powerful. You don't think your students are going to hear that objection when they get to university? You don't think you've already started to wrestle with that objection? You don't think there's people in this room right now who reject God's existence because of some form of evil? I want to offer you the same template I use in my criminal cases to think again about the problem of evil. Because I think the way I told you there are usually complex factors, I think there are many good reasons why God would allow any act of evil yet still be all-powerful and all-loving. I'm going to offer a number, an accurate view of eternity. I'm going to offer the proper understanding of free agency, a proper definition of love, the role that it plays in character development, how God uses evil to call us. I'm going to talk about also the consequence of evil, just as we do stupid things because we're stupid. And finally, I want us to think about what we think we know about God. These are 7 things that I think have to be considered the same way I considered the 6 things for Jackie. These are 7 reasons why I think God would allow any act of evil and still be a holy, all-powerful, loving God. If you've suffered evil, hang with me for a second, and let's think clearly about why God might have allowed it. The first thing that I think changes everything is an accurate view of eternity. I will tell you, as an atheist, I saw life as a line segment. You know, you have a point called birth, a point called death, and you have 90 years in between. I hope to get 90, right? My mom's side of the family lives into their mid-90s. So I was hoping for 90 pain-free, enjoyable years. And if I don't get 90 pain-free years, I'm going to call that evil. So for example, if I came down with cancer, say at 40, and suffered 10 years trying to fight it and then died at 50, I'm going to be upset. And I'm going to call that evil. And many of you have suffered that kind of loss in your family. Because we expect something and we're not getting it. This is evil because we had this expectation and now we've lost it. It turns out that everything that we determine is evil, we do so on the basis of our idea of what our life ought to have been. How many of you in this room, when you were an infant, had to have an operation that was really brutal and you almost died, but you needed that operation to fix a valve in your heart or something, and that's why you survived to this day? Raise your hand if you're someone like that. There's always a few, right? And I'll bet you, if I was to stop your life at that point when you had this operation, you would say, oh man, life stinks. If I stopped you, if I could find a way to have you be able to voice how you were feeling the day of the operation or the day after the operation, it was brutal. But by the time you're like 3 or 5 years old, you've already forgotten about it. Why? Because this evil, again, is measured in the context of your life. And by the time you're out here, or here, or here, it's no big deal anymore. You suffered it for a moment compared to your 90 years. Right? Now the question is, what if I'm wrong about my idea of what life is? What if life's not a line segment, but is instead a ray that starts here at birth, extends through the thing we call death, and then goes off infinitely in that direction? Life is not a line segment. Life is a ray, according to Christianity. If life is a ray, then anything that happens in this point we call life, which is actually just your temporal life, compared to eternity, think about your 90 years compared to forever. 100 years into forever, your 90 years is only half your life. 200 years, and you see what I'm saying? The longer this extends in that direction, the shorter by comparison is your mortal life, until finally your mortal life is like a blink compared to your real life. So you could have the worst 90 years consecutive you could ever think of having. But guess what? In the context of our worldview, where we believe in eternal life, that's a millisecond. Because that evil has to be measured in the context of what we call life. That's what we do with evil. We measure it in the context of what we call life. So my problem with evil was simply that I had the wrong view of life. Evil should be a problem for atheists, but it shouldn't be a problem for you guys. Because we ought to live like this is true. When we start belly aching about evil, it's because we're living like the line segment is true. Let's go one more step on this. What if it's not just a proper view of eternity? What if it's also a proper definition of free agency? Do we understand the power of this? Here's what I mean. We often underestimate how important free will is. If you had a choice between two kinds of worlds that God could create, a loving God, would a loving God create a world where love is possible or a world where love is impossible? Which of these two do you think a loving God would create? A world in which love is possible, right? Why would you call him loving if you could never love in the world that God created? But think about that for a second. My wife and I, we were married on Valentine's Day. Let's say we broke up and I sent her on Valentine's Day this loving card in order to reinitiate our relationship. You will love me. Roses are red, bullets are lead. Take me back now or get shot in the head. I know she's going to run right back to me, right, and want to get back in that relationship, right? That's ridiculous because we recognize the poem is funny, but we also know that you cannot force someone to love you or take you back. It turns out that genuine love requires you to have the free agency necessary to do it freely. If you were programmed to love, that would not really be love because you'd just be programmed. It's like you can't, that's just it's not a free choice. Love only has meaning at all when somebody chooses it freely. So you have to have free agency. Oh, really? You want to create a world in which love is possible, which means you need a world with free agency. Well, get ready for that because a world that requires free agency also requires us to have the freedom to hate one another in addition to love one another. If you want Jackie to be the kind of girl who could love, you have to allow for the monster who could hate. Now, that makes some sense given that our lives are eternal. And they're not judged by whether we have a good day, a bad day, or a good year, or a good life, or a bad life on this temporal planet. They are eternal. But you can see the problem here. The problem is this is a dangerous world, a world in which love is possible. Now, I'll tell you this. An evil God would throw this knife at you and wouldn't tell you how to catch it by the handle or the blade. That is not what God does. God gives you this dangerous world and gives you a set of guidelines so you will not abuse your freedoms. He's given you the freedoms and the instruction manual. Now, you might ignore the instruction manual and abuse your freedoms, but that's not God doing that. An evil God wouldn't give you the instruction manual. A good God gives you the instruction manual. You might still reject it because he wants love to be genuine. You might love God's word, but it's not because you're wired to love God's word. In fact, you're rebellious. You're a fallen mess. When you choose to love God's word, you must really love it because it's so counterintuitive, isn't it? Doesn't it seem like we could write this? If I was going to write a manual, it wouldn't sound like the words of Jesus. Also, we've got to remember, when we talk about love, what are we really talking about? I mean, you hear this all the time, right? If a loving God would treat us a certain way. Really? But what's your definition of love? The culture has redefined what love is. So when we use this word, most time in the culture, people mean something kind of different. They mean one of these things, right? But if you're a parent in this room, raise your hand. Okay, parents, is this the only kind of love we show our kids? No. Why do you say that so quickly? Because you know that if you're a parent, you've experienced and had to express tough love. What is that? That's sometimes doing the tough stuff with your kids because you know it's not, they're not going to like this, but it's in their best interest. It's for their own good. There's a writer named C.S. Lewis. I'm going to use a lot of his work in the next few slides. I want you to see it, though. He's brilliant. I've quoted him a lot in my books, and people will sometimes write to me and quote back, I love this line from your book. And it's always a C.S. Lewis line. I'm like, really? The best quotes in my book are not mine. They're a guy who's been dead for a long time. But yes, it's true. Here's what C.S. Lewis says about this. He says that we want, in fact, not so much a father in heaven as a grandfather in heaven. A senile benevolence who, as they say, liked to see young people enjoying themselves, and whose plan for the universe was simply that it might be truly said at the end of each day, a good time was had by all. Okay, that's what we want from God, but that's not what love is. By the way, that's what it looks like from grandparents, though, right? If you're a grandparent in this room, raise your hand. How many times do you do something with your grandkids that you know if you were a parent, you would never do that? Right. I can't wait to do that with my own kids, right? My own grandkids, because I'm thinking, you can't have that candy? Just don't tell your parents. There you go. So I think that this is something we have a tendency to mistake. We think that God, now remember, it is about parenting. Look, this timeline we talked about here, okay? This is your temporal life, and this is your eternal life out here. You might put it this way. This is your earthly bound life, and this is your post-earthly life. Now, we all have parents, and we know that parents, sometimes in our earthly life, will allow us to suffer some evil because they know they're aiming at something good downfield. So when my daughter wanted to take a year off of school, of college, living 8 hours from us, I said, you can do that, but it will be unsupported by me. You'll have no net. Because I can't give you the false idea that you could live this way without making a living on your own, and you just see what that's like. So she spent a year struggling as I watched her, and so many times wanted to step in and solve a problem because I knew I had to allow her this to get something good over here. Does that make sense? By the way, now suddenly she's back enrolled in school full time. There you go. But if this is of course what we do as earthly parents. Now if there's an eternal parent, it seems to me he might take a similar approach. He might allow you to suffer some evil here, and you're thinking, well, yeah, but I never see anything good from it. If that's true, then where's my good thing coming? Well, it's not over here, you knucklehead. It might be over here. Doesn't that make sense? If there's an eternal parent who, and we got a proper definition of love, it's not about making you happy. He's not your eternal grandfather. He's your eternal father. And love always points to something lasting, not something immediate. God is far less concerned in your comfort than he is in your character. I did 26 years working casework, and the better half of that in the end was working cold cases. And those cases got on national media. I think I've been on Dateline more than any other detective in the country. And the people who are involved in the process, if it's not that show or other media shows, are not always believers, but they get a sense of, wow, this guy can puzzle a case together. Not that I am the only one who can do that, but you develop that skill set. If you're working in this industry, trust me, if you're out there watching this video, you know, if you're a cop, how to put a case together. So once you've demonstrated that, I think, for people, they may not agree with your conclusion, but remember, the evidence doesn't say anything. And science doesn't say anything. It's scientists and evidence evaluators that say something. So we're all looking at the same data points. We're all looking at the same evidence. I've got to draw an inference from the evidence, and I land it this way. Now, you may not agree with my inferences, but I think you can at least respect the fact that I've done the homework of presenting the evidence so an audience can assess it for themselves. So that's why I think I have supporters who don't agree with my inferences, but they respect the process. And that's one of the things I try to do uniquely in God's Crime Scene. I'm trying to give the readers not just here are the facts, but here are how detectives assemble facts to develop a case. Here are the processes, the rules that we obey, how we put a cumulative case together. How do we make cases? That's what I want you to come away with also, not just here are the facts, because you can get that out of any book. I want this to be unique in the sense that this is a book that not only gives you the data, but it instructs you on how to build a case, how to put the data together.
Be sure to visit the Cold Case Christianity website daily to read Jim's blog, watch the weekly video, or listen to the Cold Case Christianity podcast. You'll also find great free resources, including the free downloadable monthly Bible insert. While you're there, be sure to sign up for Jim's daily case note email. Cold Case Christianity is designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
What's the best explanation for moral laws?
I think all of us accept certain moral truths, and we get those from someplace. I mean, you have your own personal views on something. I've worked gangsters who had their own personal views on what was right and wrong that were very different than mine, very different than yours probably. And their gangs, a bigger group, had a certain set of laws, and if you want to be part of that, you took on those laws. We all live in a city that has certain laws, and we fall underneath that. So you can get your views from people, but that's, of course, we might disagree. You can get your views from groups or governments, but governments and groups disagree. But there are some laws that transcend all of us. They really aren't grounded in individuals or groups because they transcend individuals and groups. There are some things we disagree about and some things we agree altogether. Even before there were people, we agreed probably that it was never okay to torture people for fun. You might have some sense of when it might be okay to torture people, I can't even imagine. But if you did, it was certainly never for fun. So if this rule was in place, it was in place, if this idea, this concept of morality was in place, if you believe in a Star Trek universe, that rule doesn't only apply to us as humans, it applies to every other race of aliens. It transcends not only the individual, the group, the nation, the planet, the species. Wow, where could such a transcendent, objective moral law come from? What is the authority that transcends all of this that could provide for such things? It seems to me the best and most reasonable source, grounding for those kinds of transcendent views is in a transcendent lawgiver, a transcendent source, who doesn't create these views willy-nilly. And he's not just describing views that existed before him. He's the actual source of such truth because they're simply a reflection of his divine nature. If that's the case, I think we can properly ground objective, transcendent moral values that we all agree exist, or most of us agree, especially when pushed to the example I just gave. Yet we don't want to agree on how they can be grounded. Well, I hope that kind of helps you to think through the issue of evil and look at several reasonable explanations for why God might allow any act of evil. Remember, it's like a puzzle when we puzzle back together as detectives why any particular crime has occurred, why any particular act of evil has occurred. We can do the same thing when describing evil in general. Why would God, what are the puzzle pieces that would explain why this event came together? What are the relationships between the puzzle pieces? That's what we're trying to do in this presentation. Again, this is all from God's crime scene. So next week we'll continue this and finish our explanation of the factors involved behind any act of evil. So join us right here at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.
This program was made possible through your generous donations to NRB TV. Join Jim Wallis and others for the 4th Annual Defending Truth Conference. For information and tickets, visit nrbtv.org/DTC.
I see my friends out there getting waves. It's like, it's hard. It was a surprise to me when they told me I had MS. It's like, you sure?